Now that you know a bit more about the time period in which Robert Louis Stevenson's novella was composed, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to the novella itself. And remember, we called it a novella because it's shorter than a novel, but longer than a short story. It will be helpful if you have your copy of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with you as you watch this presentation. As I mentioned in my presentation on the Victorian period, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was written by the author Robert Louis Stevenson in 1886. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde tells the story of an upper middle class doctor named Dr. Henry Jekyll and a mysterious man named Edward Hyde to whom Jekyll is somehow connected. Figuring out how they're connected makes up the plot of much of the story. Two of the other main characters you'll encounter are two of Jekyll's close friends, the lawyer Gabriel John Utterson and a fellow doctor named Hasty Lanyon. Utterson is both Jekyll's friend and lawyer, and much of the narrative is focalized through Utterson's perspective. By focalized, I simply mean that although much of the narrative is told in the third person, it mostly focuses on Utterson's perspective on events. Utterson spends much of his time trying to figure out who Edward Hyde is and how he and Jekyll are connected. Although Dr. Lanyon, Dr. Jekyll, and Utterson are old friends, by the time our story begins, Lanyon and Jekyll have grown apart because of some sort of disagreement. As the story progresses, you will also meet some of Jekyll's servants, including his butler, Poole. The novella begins with a paragraph describing Gabriel Utterson to the reader. This first paragraph is probably one of the densest paragraphs in the whole novella, but it nicely sets up Utterson's character, so I wanted to start by looking at it together right now and breaking it down. Take a moment and flip to page 33 in your Broadview edition of Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. First, let's read the paragraph together. Mr. Utterson the lawyer was a man of a rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. At friendly meetings, and when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke not only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. He was austere with himself, drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. But he had an approved tolerance for others, sometimes wondering, almost with envy, at the high pressure of spirits involved in their misdeeds, and in any extremity inclined to help rather than to reprove. "I incline to Cain's heresy," he used to say quaintly. "I let my brother go to the devil in his own way." In this character, it was frequently his fortune to be the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of down-going men. And to such as these, so long as they came about his chambers, he never marked a shade of change in his demeanor. Now I'd like you to take a few minutes and use your phone or your computer to look up some of the words you're not familiar with. Then we'll look carefully together at the paragraph. I'll give you one more minute, and I do hope you're taking this time to look up some of those words that you don't know. Okay, why don't we now look at the paragraph together? Many of the phrases used to describe Mr. Utterson paint a rather dismal, depressing picture of this character. The very first sentence tells us that his rugged countenance, the countenance being the face, was never lighted by a smile. So right off the bat, we're told that he hardly ever smiles. Plus, as the next sentence goes on to tell us, he was cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse. Discourse means speech or conversation, and scanty means small or insufficient. So essentially, we learn that he doesn't talk very much. And when he does, his conversation is somewhat awkward and without a lot of warmth. He's also backward in sentiment, so he's not very good at expressing his emotions or feelings, his sentiment in other words. And finally, he's lean, long, dusty, and dreary. If you skip down a few lines, this rather depressing description of Mr. Utterson continues. We're told that he was austere with himself. Austere means strict, so it sounds like he doesn't indulge himself very much. This is confirmed by the phrases following the semicolon. According to the narrator, Mr. Utterson drank gin when he was alone to mortify a taste for vintages, and though he enjoyed the theater, had not crossed the doors of one for 20 years. Many people misread this first phrase the first time they read it and think it means that he drinks a lot when he's alone. If you look more carefully at it, though, we can see that it means something different from this. It says that he drinks gin when he's alone to mortify a taste for vintages. First of all, it's important to know that gin was a cheap drink during the 19th century and not something that would have been favored by connoisseurs of fine beverages. Vintages, on the other hand, are fine old wines. Now, Utterson drinks this cheap gin to mortify a taste for expensive fine wines. Mortify means to subdue or suppress something. So basically, when he's alone, not at a big dinner party or entertaining people himself, he won't let himself drink the fine wines that he really likes. Instead, he drinks this cheap drink to suppress his desire for the fine wine. If this doesn't paint a picture of someone who's strict with himself, then how about the next line? Even though he enjoyed the theater, he hadn't allowed himself to go to the theater for 20 years. These phrases do not paint the most cheerful picture of Mr. Utterson, but there are phrases that complicate this simple, dreary picture of this character. For instance, the end of the second sentence tells us that even though he doesn't smile or talk very much, and even though he's dusty and dreary, he's nevertheless somehow lovable. How could this be, given everything else we've learned about him? According to the third sentence, it has something to do with the acts of his life. So his actions, perhaps, rather than his manner. What are these acts that endear this otherwise dusty and dreary lawyer to others? For the answer to that, let's look at the second half of the paragraph. We learn here that even though he's strict with himself, he had an approved tolerance for others, which seems to suggest that he tolerates behavior in others that he wouldn't in himself. This is confirmed if we go a little further, where we're told that he was, in any extremity, inclined to help rather than to reprove. An extremity in this case would mean a bad or difficult situation, and reprove means to reprimand or scold someone for something that they've done. However, when someone is in a bad situation, Utterson does not reprimand or reprove that person. Rather, he is inclined to help. This leads to him often being the last reputable acquaintance and the last good influence in the lives of downgoing men. So, men who are losing their place in society or perhaps their fortune due to their bad actions. As I said, this is probably one of the most densely packed paragraphs in the whole novella, so don't despair if you feel like you might not have noticed all of these details on your own. The fact that it is such a full paragraph is a big part of why I wanted to look at it together before you jumped into the reading yourselves. I also hope that looking at this together has set you up with some good habits. For instance, if you completely don't know what a word means, looking it up is probably a good idea. I also hope this has set you up so that you'll pay attention to other character descriptions when they come up. And of course, as we've been doing throughout the semester, underline, highlight, and/or take notes on parts that seem important. So, here are some final thoughts as you head into reading the novella itself. As the action of the novella starts, Utterson is taking a walk with a relative of his named Mr. Enfield. During this walk, Enfield tells Utterson a very strange story about a door. Thus the title of the first chapter, which is Story of a Door. This story initiates us into the mysteries at the heart of the novella. I hope you enjoy trying to unravel these mysteries as you begin reading Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. For information on how to cite this presentation in your essays, check out the document on citing this video and the video introducing the Victorian period. That document can be found in the Online Readings and Videos folder in which you found this presentation.